What's up, guys? Geography video again. Okay, so this video is gonna be about South Sudan, baby. Okay, so we're gonna go to South Sudan. Let's wait for it to load. Okay, let's start. South Sudan is a country in Eastern Africa, almost on the equator, but not really. It's bordered by several countries. It borders Sudan to the north, Ethiopia to the east, Uganda to the south, the Democratic Republic of the Congo to the south, and Central African Republic to the west, and Sudan to the north. Its capital and largest city is Juba, right here. It's not a growing city, but it's one of the growing cities in South Sudan. And Juba sits right on the White Nile River, and we can actually take a pic. And let's see the White Nile River. The White Nile River it's pretty big in South Sudan. This is the White Nile River. Over down there, that's the river flowing to Sudan. Over down there, that's the river flowing back to Uganda. So if we went this way, we would be going to Uganda, but we're in South Sudan. South Sudan is a cool country. The shape is kind of wacky, but it's cool. Now we're going to get a little bit into more geography. The biggest city in South Sudan is Juba. It sits right on the Nile. And there's a lot of other villages and towns too. But let's get the regions. So first there's Central Equatoria, there's Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan, Western Equatoria, Yambio, Eastern Equatoria, Toret, Jongle, Bor, Unity, Bentu, Upper Nile, and the Upper Nile is like in northern Sudan too, northern South Sudan, and Malakal. Now I'm going to get a little history, but first we're going to finish geography. There should be a river. There's a rivers with Sudan's borders too, South Sudan's borders. This is the Nile River entering into Sudan. I think, let's see, yeah, this is the White Nile River, and this is the river between Sudan and South Sudan. When a country is bordered by a river, they do it like this. One half owns that country, and the other half of the river owns to this country. So South Sudan owns this half, Sudan owns this half. Sudan is a really big country, so they take lots of South Sudan's land. But South Sudan has a big chunk right here too. And there's the Gambela region in Ethiopia, and there's Pakak. Pakak is a little town really close to the border with South Sudan, but it's in Ethiopia right here. Here, this is a river between Ethiopia and South Sudan, so this separates the countries. A lot of the countries always have rivers separating each other, like Eritrea and Ethiopia, Eritrea and Djibouti, Ethiopia and Sudan, lots. There's a river separating Eritrea. I gotta stop doing that. South Sudan and Ethiopia. With these wiggly lines are the rivers. And South Sudan also should have a river too. Okay, let's see. This is the border with Kenya and South Sudan, and this is the river. This is the river separating. Kenya owns this side, and South Sudan owns this side. South Sudan doesn't own much of the river because Kenya owns much of the river. Kenya is a pretty lucky country because they have a lot of water sources because they have lots of rivers in the country. They have Lake Victoria, they have Lake Turkana, which is a lake in Kenya and in Ethiopia a little bit. Kenya owns most of it though. They have so much other lakes too. They have the Indian Ocean. But anyway, now we're going to talk about the Nile River. The Nile River is a river in Africa. It's a river in Sudan, South Sudan, and the river is a big water source too, because lots of people use the river for water source. But I think But Egypt uses the river for water source too, and Sudan, because I'm not gonna lie, most desert countries, they don't get a lot of rain, and Sudan has the Nubian desert and the Libyan desert and the Sahara desert. So Sudan and the northern Sudan doesn't get a lot of rain. They get more rain in the savannas, like with the borders with Ethiopia and South Sudan and Central African Republic, even a little bit with Chad too. But Sudan is mostly a desert country. A lot of Sudanese people don't want to admit it, but it is true. Most of the country is desert. Most of northern Africa is basically a desert. But yeah, Sudan and Egypt use the Nile for a big water use. For a big water use. So that's why the Nile is important to these countries, because they don't get much water. They don't have enough rain. And same for South Sudan too, because it's a growing country. It just separated from Sudan not that long ago, really. There's so many people that's older than South Sudan. Even I'm older than South Sudan. Even my mom is older than Eritrea. There's a lot of people who are older than South Sudan too. But anyway, the Nile River is a river in South Sudan. It's the biggest river in South Sudan. The Nile is the biggest river in several countries, in Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. South Sudan admires the Nile River, and they use it for a big water source. They have the White Nile River, and there's so many names for the Nile River. And and technically, to answer your question, Eritrea has the Nile River, but in Eritrea they call it the Barka River. So if they just change the name, because the Barka River connects with the Nile River, without Sudan's help, Eritrea doesn't have access to the Nile. So the Barka River, it flows into Sudan, and then it connects with the Nile. So yes, Eritrea has the Nile, but not a lot of people think that. Because they think that they just a name. So if Eritrea changed the Barka River to the Black Nile, and if Sudan also changed their name if Sudan changed their river to the Black Nile, then Eritrea would have access, which they already do. It's just the names. But anyway, let's talk about history of South Sudan. South Sudan is its own country. We all know that. It's been its own country for more than a decade, but before South Sudan was its own country, it was part of Sudan. Because South Sudan wasn't even its own country, so Sudan technically owned it as its own region. So South Sudan was just Sudan's regions, and then back then Sudan was the biggest country, and then Algeria came in second, and Democratic Republic of the Congo came in third. But Sudan and South Sudan have been fighting over the years, because Sudan is an Islamic country. We all know that. They're Muslims. And South Sudanese people, they didn't want to be Muslim. They wanted to be Christians. But Sudan said that they had to be Muslims whether they liked it or not. But South Sudan didn't want to be Islamic people. They wanted to be Christianity. And then Sudan wanted to fight. And then Sudan and South Sudan were fighting, because South Sudan thinks that South Sudan shouldn't have to think that Sudan controls it. So that's why South Sudan is its own country. It broke off from Sudan. If before South Sudan became its own country, if their regions was just Islamic, then South Sudan wouldn't even be its own country right now. So Sudan used to be the biggest country in Africa, but then it broke off because they've been fighting, and now Algeria is the biggest. But first, Egypt was the biggest country, because Egypt owned Sudan and technically South Sudan too, so they were the biggest. But after all war and blah blah blah, now Algeria is the biggest country. And then the Democratic Republic of the Congo comes in second, and Sudan is third. It's kind of the same thing for Eritrea too. Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, but then Eritrea broke off from Ethiopia, and Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia. Same for South Sudan. Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia, and South Sudan gained independence from Sudan. Now I can kind of see why they think Sudan and South Sudan, Ethiopia and Eritrea are related. As Ethiopia and Sudan owned two countries, and South Sudan and Eritrea were warriors, and then they broke off from these countries with strongness. So now I guess Sudan, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Eritrea are related, I guess. Yeah, life's funny. But anyway, thanks for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed. The next video is going to be geography about Somalia. Okay, goodbye.